The following story has few concrete details. It seems that no one is willing to talk openly about what happened at a small private zoo in Russia on December 2, 2017. Set within the Istra district, located 25 miles west of Moscow, lies the village of Obnovyeny Trud. The locals seem to be a close-knit community, that is, except for one local in particular. Sergei Alexandrovsky made his millions in the airline industry, currently the chief executive officer at Rossiya Airlines. He spent his money on another passion of his, animals. In the early 2000s, he set up a private zoo at his home in the village. He opened it to paying guests. It was more of a menagerie than a zoo, with animals held in small enclosures, isolated, and with little in the way of environmental enrichment. In 2020, Russia passed a law that meant keeping many exotic animals privately was banned. This was for the welfare of the animals as well as the safety of the owners. However, before the law was passed, it was relatively easy for civilians to purchase and keep exotic pets within Russia. Those purchased before 2020 are allowed to be kept until the end of their natural life. Some locals in Sergei's village didn't like having the zoo animals on their doorstep. It made them feel uneasy and unsafe. At night, they heard the roaring of the lone lion. They heard its constant deep grunting as it paced up and down in its enclosure. It was something that many described as annoying, but the animals wanted to get out. They wanted to escape. It was deemed a dangerous neighborhood for fear of what lurked in Sergei's backyard. As well as housing a lion and a tiger, Sergei's zoo was also home to a black panther whose name was Milan. After 10 years without incident, except for some disgruntled neighbors, something was about to go horribly wrong. Security wasn't as tight as it perhaps should have been. People could walk right up to the big cat's cages, just inches from the animals' faces. Although the details are sketchy, and the following is a presumption from the zoo's owner, Sergei, it seems the most likely explanation for what happened that day. A Ukrainian man was staying with two of his friends nearby. It was a reunion of sorts, and the three of them were enjoying plenty of drinks when they decided to visit the zoo. Under the influence of a significant amount of alcohol, they began to behave mischievously, and one of them claimed that he could feed the black panther. He was bold and brazen, fueled by the alcohol in his system and the confidence it gave him as he walked up to the enclosure. The holes in the black metal mesh were too small to put his hand through, so instead, he decided to try the gate. It was locked. The panther was lying, resting on its wooden shelf inside one section of its enclosure. It lifted its head and watched the man as he tried to work out how to get in through the gate. Its placid appearance lulled the man into a false sense of security. Despite having been locked up its entire life, the panther was anything but docile. It still had its killer instinct, and the foolish man was about to enter its territory, its domain, the one thing that belonged to it, and the one thing that it could instinctively protect. The Ukrainian man managed to break the lock and force his way into the enclosure. The second he stepped foot inside, the black panther leapt down from its shelf. It trotted over to the man and, without hesitation, leapt onto him. Black panthers are melanistic variants of leopards or jaguars, and it has not been divulged which species this one was. Both stalk their prey, getting within feet of it before pouncing on top of it. Leopards dispatch smaller prey by a single bite to the back of its neck, severing the spinal column or crushing the skull. They kill larger prey by suffocating it with a bite to the throat. Jaguars typically subdue their prey by a bite to the back of the neck. They have the third strongest bite force after lions and tigers, but the strongest relative to their size. They can clamp their jaws down with a force of 1,500 psi, enough to crush a human skull. Whichever species this one was, it was a formidable predator. The man leapt when the jaguar jumped down off its shelf. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. His heart began pounding, and he realized just how stupid he had been. He had foolishly assumed the panther would remain on its shelf and allow him to hand feed it. But as it leapt onto him, he was brought crashing down to the cold, hard stone floor. He let out a cry. In the seconds before the fatal bite, he could feel the warmth of the panther's body on top of him. He could feel its heavy weight as it pinned him down. He couldn't move. He couldn't push it off him. The panther's eyes were fixated on its prey. In his final moment, he felt the warm, moist breath of the panther as it closed its jaws around his throat. He struggled to breathe. The pressure on his windpipe grew, and he knew this was the end. The big cat's canines severed an artery as it bit down harder, and blood poured out of the wound. Moments later, the man was still. It is assumed that his two friends fled the scene. Whether they had run to get help or to escape is not known, but they left him there on the gray slate floor of the enclosure, breathing his last breath. The black panther didn't eat the man. Instead, it stood up and raised its nose in the air. It walked over to the gate and sniffed it. The gate had been left unlocked. The panther pushed it with its nose and it swung open. Tentatively, the panther stepped through it. It was out. Nobody noticed it, and when it leapt over a fence and off the property, it disappeared into the surrounding neighborhood. Later, the man's body was discovered. Other visitors screamed when they saw him lying on the ground, a pool of dark blood around his head. Then it dawned on them the cage door was open. The black panther was out and about somewhere. It was lurking in the neighborhood and could attack at any moment. A local walked his dog along the street, unaware of the potential danger he was in. Crucially, nobody was informed of the Black Panther incident at the time. The authorities were called to the scene, and Sergei Alexandrovsky arrived at the Panther's enclosure. Initial reports were that a keeper had been killed because of the uniform the man was wearing, but Sergei denied knowing the man, saying that he did not work there. He suggested that the man was drunk and entered the enclosure on a dare. It seemed like a possibility. But at that moment, the most important thing was to find the Black Panther before it could cause any more damage. Nobody knew where it was, and there hadn't been any reported sightings. Instead of informing the locals and warning them to stay indoors, the authorities decided that they didn't want to make a fuss or cause alarm. It was better if they dealt with the situation privately, without the public getting involved. It took several hours before the big cat was located. It hadn't gone far and was found crouched underneath some undergrowth, probably scared in its unfamiliar surrounds. When it was eventually recaptured, Sergei insisted that it should not be killed. When locals found out what had happened, there was outrage, not least of all because they hadn't been informed that the cat had escaped. Children had been playing outside. People had been walking their dogs. Anybody could have been attacked in the hours that followed the incident. Some said that they wished it had been Sergei who had been killed by the panther. At least then, maybe his zoo would be shut down and they could walk their neighborhood without fear. An investigative committee that deals with serious crimes in Russia was sent to work on the case. They needed to determine the cause of death and the handling of the situation. No conclusions from the report have been published, and the name of the deceased has never been disclosed. As of this day, the Black Panther was never put down. It was deemed a defensive attack, as the man entered its cage unexpectedly. The zoo also remains open for business, the animals waiting for the day that someone else opens up one of their cages, so they can bring someone else to their terrifying final affliction. Barbara Paschke loved bears. In fact, she loved them so much that she broke the law so that she could see them up close. By leaving out sunflower seeds and millet in her backyard, she enticed them to her back door. She admired the impressive animals, watching safely from behind her windows. Not only was she feeding the bears for her own satisfaction, but she also felt like she was ensuring they had food in times of hardship. However, it is illegal to feed bears, and for very good reason. Bears can become habituated to humans. They learn to associate people with food and a free meal. And if that food is ever withdrawn, then they can become aggressive, destructive, and deadly. By feeding her beloved wild bears, Barbara was not only putting her neighbors in danger, but she was also putting herself in danger. On top of that, she inadvertently put the bears in harm's way. If they ever turned aggressive or were seen getting too close to people's properties, then they would be removed or worse, killed by the authorities. But Barbara didn't think of those consequences, and even when she was cited for her behavior in 2012, she continued to feed black bears in her neighborhood. But now something was about to go horribly wrong. Barbara was an 85-year-old woman who lived beside Ashley Lake near Kalispell in the northwestern corner of Montana. It was a beautiful location. Her rural home was on the outskirts of Flathead National Forest, which lies adjacent to Glacier National Park, an area known for its bears. There may have been a reason for Barbara's careless behavior, something that changed her perspective on things. In 2009, she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and her family believed that this altered her perspective on how to preserve wildlife wisely and safely. On September 27, 2015, a time when bears were filling up their fat reserves ready for the long winter months ahead, a bear walked into Barbara's yard. It was expecting the usual food that she scattered about her lawn, but this time, Barbara hadn't put any out that day, so instead the bear went searching for some. It was a young female black bear. She had learned to associate Barbara's house with an easy meal. The bear walked across the yard and towards the house. It sniffed around the sides of the building, working its way towards the back door. Inside, Barbara was unaware that one of her favorite animals was so close. But this wasn't just a curious bear. It was a hungry bear. And it was a conditioned bear. Somehow the bear managed to force itself inside Barbara's house and began turning the place upside down. When Barbara heard a noise in her kitchen, she went to investigate. Then, as she peered around the corner of the hallway, she spotted the bear rummaging through her things. It was one of the black bears she was familiar with, but inside her home it looked much bigger. Barbara froze and watched in horror for a few moments as the bear ransacked her house. She couldn't reach her phone without moving, and she would have to get past the bear to get out of her house. She was trapped. Nobody knows how the bear got inside the property, but it spotted Barbara shortly afterwards and lumbered towards her. With nowhere to go and nowhere to hide, the elderly lady braced herself for what was to come. The bear suddenly leapt up at Barbara, its jaws clacking, its powerful paws pushing her to the floor. Barbara let out a yell, but nothing could have prepared her for the attack that ensued. She crashed onto the floor, the air escaping from her lungs, and she gasped. She smacked the back of her head on the ground and looked up at the mighty beast. Its dripping jowls were just inches from her face. She could smell its breath. She could see directly into its dark, shiny eyes. The bear growled as it pushed its face into Barbara. She tried to protect herself, desperately trying to curl up into the fetal position and interlock her hands behind her neck. But she was still exposed. The bear tore into the old lady's flesh, its canines ripping into her shoulders and arms. It pinned her down with its large paws as its claws sliced her skin. Barbara screamed for help, and moments later the bear stepped off her, climbed up onto a work surface, and climbed out through one of the windows. The attack had only lasted a few seconds, but the damage had been done. As the adrenaline wore off, Barbara could now feel the intense, searing pain from the attack. She lay bleeding on the floor of her home, unable to move and unable to reach the phone. She was in a state of shock and in desperate need of help, but no one came. As the minutes ticked by, Barbara was losing consciousness. The wounds had cut deep into her muscle, torn tendons, and were festering with bacteria. She was fading fast, but Barbara was a fighter, and she managed to pull herself towards her home phone and call for help. Emergency services arrived within minutes. The sheriff's department, along with the wildlife response team, rushed to the rural scene. When officers broke into the property, they found the home completely ransacked and Barbara lying on the floor. They rushed to her side. Miraculously, she was still breathing. She was still alive, but only just. Barbara was ambulanced off to Kalispell Regional Medical Center in a critical condition. Nobody knew if she would make it. Over the next couple of days, doctors fought to save Barbara, and she was a tough lady. It looked like she was going to pull through, giving everyone the hope they needed. But then, Tragically, on the morning of October 1st, she passed away from her injuries. Her death was a shock for the neighborhood. She was popular amongst the locals, and her loss was felt far and wide. Following the devastating attack, the whole community was put on high alert. There was a killer on the loose, and it wasn't afraid to break into people's homes to get what it wanted. Traps were set up to catch the bear responsible. Officers walked from door to warn people about the bear or bears in the area, but their efforts to capture the nuisance bear were thwarted when they discovered that somebody else in the neighborhood was also feeding the bears. And not only that, they continued to feed the bears even after hearing the news about Barbara and knowing an investigation was in full swing. With wildlife officers posted to the neighborhood night and day, they managed to catch 2 black bears. They weren't very old, only yearlings, but in their young lives they had become dependent on humans for food. The 2 bears confidently strolled into the neighborhood searching for food. The seed that various people had put out in their gardens had kept them coming back for more, but given the recent events, they were now seen as a threat to the community. With heavy hearts, the wildlife officers euthanized both of them. When the yearlings were taken away and examined, they had a significant amount of millet and sunflower seeds in their digestive tracts. The people who had deliberately fed the bears had now contributed to their deaths. The officers had no choice. The bears had learned that they could get an easy meal from the neighborhood and weren't going to stop coming back. It would be irresponsible to release potentially dangerous bears somewhere else when the bears are habituated to people. Scientific evidence suggests that bears pass on their nuisance behavior to their cubs too. So when these 2 black bears matured, they could bring their cubs back to the same neighborhood with potentially disastrous consequences. But the DNA from both the yearlings were not exact matches to the bear that was responsible for Barbara's death. Results did, however, show that the bear that attacked Barbara was a sister of one of the euthanized bears. After 3 weeks of setting up traps and scouting the area, the search for the bear was called off. There are thought to be around 15,000 black bears throughout Montana and 800 grizzlies. Brown bears are responsible for the most attacks across North America, but they are considered rare, and fatalities from them are rarer still. A black bear entering a home and fatally mauling someone has never been heard of before, and no known fatalities have ever occurred from bear attacks in Flathead's 2.5 million acre forest until now, after Barbara Paschke met her terrifying final affliction. Stephan Pereira was a medical transcriptionist and an animal lover. She lived in the rural village of Enchutengu, located in the Tiruvananthapuram district of the Indian state of Kerala. There had been calls of concern for the number of stray dogs that were now living in and around the local communities. Some people had been bitten by them, and they were worried not just about the dog's aggression, but also about the spread of disease. Although they were becoming a problem, nothing was being done about them. But for Stephan, they weren't seen as a problem. She could see the goodness in their eyes and the sadness as they struggled to survive in the harsh rural streets. Every day, Stephan would bring them scraps of food. Any leftovers she had or could find, she would gather up and take to the stray dogs. It gave her great pleasure knowing that she was helping them in some small way, even if it was just ensuring they had full bellies for that night. She was a kind-hearted soul who worked extremely hard in her job. She wasn't married and had no children, and so she divided her time between working and feeding the stray dogs near her home. Nobody thought anything of Stephan's habit of feeding the stray dogs. She wasn't harming anyone by doing it. But the other locals were often nervous of the strays, and they were right to be. It was true that some of them carried disease, and some of them carried one of the most deadly diseases, rabies. There are thought to be around 62 million stray dogs in India. The country has the highest rate of human rabies in the world, largely due to the huge numbers of stray dogs that transmit the disease to people. It is thought that there are around 20,000 human deaths from rabies in India every year. which is more than a third of the global total. One day, as Stefan was heading to the spot where she fed the dogs, one of them trotted over to her. It was acting differently. It was cagey. There was a slight foaming at the mouth. There were lots of dogs, all with different characters that Stefan had come to know. Some were timid and hesitated before tucking in. Others were bold and dominant, pushing the others out of the way when the scraps were thrown in front of them. This time, when Stefan bent down to place one of the many bowls of food on the ground, the strange dog lunged forwards, scrabbling to get at the food. One of its paws landed on Stefan's hand, and its claw scratched her. She instinctively drew her hand back and inspected it. The scratch had broken through the skin. It was bleeding, but it was small. Stefan thought nothing of it and walked back to her house and washed the cut. But a deadly disease was taking hold of Stefan. It was coursing through her bloodstream and spreading throughout her body. She needed urgent medical attention if she was to stand any chance of surviving. At first, Stefan didn't feel anything. As the days and weeks passed by, she started to feel ill. It began as a flu-like illness. Then the scratch on her hand began tingling. But still, Stefan dismissed it. She was too busy with work and family life to be concerned about her own welfare. She left her house and made her way to her family home in Enchutengu, where her brother Charles had fallen ill. She visited him in the medical clinic, and it was there that the doctors noticed that she wasn't looking well and was behaving strangely. The doctors took her to one side and questioned her. It was only then that Stefan admitted that she had been scratched by a stray dog. It was such a small scratch that it hadn't concerned her, but the doctors knew better. They managed to convince Stefan that she needed medical treatment, and she finally agreed. She was rushed through for emergency treatment, but once rabies symptoms start to show, the disease is almost always fatal. It was a long, slow, and painful death for the kind-hearted Stefan. The disease began affecting her cerebral function, and she began hallucinating and developed a fear of water, anxiety, agitation, a difficulty swallowing, and involuntary muscle movements are also common with rabies victims as the disease takes hold. Just days after Stefan was admitted to the hospital, she died from the disease, leaving behind 3 siblings. Stefan was 49 years old, and she wasn't the only to die from rabies in Tiruvananthapuram Medical College that week. Just 3 days earlier, a man named Muhammad Rafi, who was 48 years old, had passed away. He had come to the hospital days after being treated for rabies at another clinic. He too had complained of the same flu-like symptoms, but his death was unexpected. Muhammad had been working as a tapping worker in a rubber tree plantation. As he was making an incision in one of the trees, a wild cat suddenly jumped on him from the branches and bit his face. He knew the dangers of being bitten by a wild animal and sought medical advice right away. He was administered the rabies vaccine and sent on his way. But a couple of weeks later, he began to show signs of having contracted rabies. He was admitted to Perupalli Medical College, and then 2 days later to Tiruvananthapuram Medical College, where Stefan had been treated. But then it was 3 weeks after the wildcat bite, and Muhammad was deteriorating fast. He died a few days later. Medical professionals were surprised that the vaccine hadn't worked for Muhammad. To die from rabies after timely administration of a vaccine is considered rare. There had also been 6 other people who had succumbed to rabies the year before, having received the vaccine shortly after being bitten. Following these deaths, the government appointed an expert committee to determine the effectiveness of the vaccines they were using. The vaccines were deemed good, but with nearly all of the cases, the infected bites had been near the head and had therefore affected the brain rapidly. It seemed that the vaccine was useless if the victim had been bitten deeply and near the head. But rabies isn't the only thing that Indians are concerned about when it comes to their stray dogs. Vicious attacks are becoming more common. Some 7 million Indians are bitten by stray dogs every year, and some of those attacks are proving deadly. In Rajasthan, 2 stray dogs entered a hospital ward and killed a 1-month-old baby whilst his mother slept. The incident shocked people. Then, only days later, a 7-year-old boy was mauled to death while he played outside his home in Uttar Pradesh. Recently, an attack on a 4-year-old boy that was caught on CCTV and then shared on social media as he was mauled to death by a pack of dogs just yards away from his father sparked the debate about what to do with India's dogs. They become more aggressive at night, prowling the streets in large packs as the heat from the day dissipates and they become more active. They often chase people away who enter their territory. Although there have been calls for a cull, with 80% of Indians being Hindu and therefore respecting and protecting all living things, this has never come to fruition. India's Animal Welfare Board suggests that stray dogs should be sterilized so they can't reproduce, and vaccinations rolled out to stop the spread of diseases like rabies. But the costs and practicalities of achieving this throughout India's urban and rural communities is prohibitive. It seems India has a real problem in its hands. It seems like more people like Stephen Pereira will meet the same terrifying final affliction.